Welcome back to Barbell Medicine YouTube channel, where we bring modern medicine to strength conditioning and strength conditioning to modern medicine. I'm Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum. This is Dr. Austin Baraki. He's the second most handsome doctor in the world. We're in San Diego. Thank you guys so much for joining us. This is a question and answer session. Thank you so much for coming. If you have to leave, we understand. And if we don't get to your question, you should post it on a forum. It's at forum.barbellmedicine.com. Also, if it doesn't get approved there because it is a moderated forum, you should first try Austin, his DMs, direct messages. He's very responsive. If he doesn't respond, then I would move to Tom. Tom's also, again, great with DMs. Then slide into Leah's DMs. And if none of those work, then we recommend following a different fitness outlet for your questions, because we just can't be bothered. So we're gonna get into these questions. Question number one: if an elderly individual who is at a healthy weight but under-muscled starts resistance training, should they be eating a caloric surplus to build muscle, given that they're eating enough protein? Well, okay, this is a good question. In general, I don't know that I recommend anybody for weight gain unless they want to. So if their personal preference is, I'd like to gain weight for whatever reason, either strength is the most important thing to them and they have the room to grow, that's fine. If they want to gain more muscle mass just for their own accord, that's fine. But just for like reducing the potential of bad health outcomes from happening, you can do that without gaining a substantial amount of body weight. And a person new to resistance training has a high likelihood of building a lot of lean body mass without increasing their body weight. We see that all the time in individuals with obesity. They simultaneously reduce their waist circumference and body fat while increasing their lean body mass. And in particular, I don't know that gaining a bunch of weight at an elderly age is likely to be a great idea, just because
if they're already at a healthy weight,
yes,
as is
yes,
kind of a qualifier in the question. I mean, I see a lot of elderly folks who are extremely underweight. It's not often that I see individuals who are have made it into their 80s with morbid obesity. Oftentimes they don't. They get kind of selected out a little bit earlier than that through various mechanisms, things that we've talked about this weekend, the medical conditions that can arise. So oftentimes the people who make it that far tend to be pretty thin and frail on the other end of the spectrum. In those situations, then getting adequate nutrition and putting them into a calorie surplus, if we can, does become a priority. But if somebody is already at a healthy weight, then I would just lean on getting them to train rather than worrying about getting them in a calorie surplus.
Well, you know what the internet's gonna say?
What?
Don't you know that in elderly population that class 1 obesity has the lowest all-cause mortality rates? How do you explain that?
The question is saying that they're at a healthy weight, so then I would ask how we're defining healthy weight here.
Sure. Well, what I'm getting at is that explanation it basically ignores, again, a few things that Dr. Baraki said. So individuals who tend to carry a lot of excess adipose tissue tend to get filtered out when we get to that elderly population, so they tend to not make it that far. And those who do, there's a survivor bias there. And in addition, once you become elderly, having a low BMI, so like in normal or particularly underweight, represents either chronic illness or increase in frailty. And so both of those things portend bad outcomes. We wouldn't necessarily want somebody who's got a normal BMI or is slightly in the lower realms of the overweight BMI range to necessarily say, I gotta get my BMI to over 30 because that's gonna reduce my risk of premature mortality or reduce disease burden.
Yep.
All right, sick, we took on the internet.
There you go.
Boom. What is something you wish you better prepared for during medical school? Like, are we restricting this to just academic topics?
Open-ended. I don't know.
Like
thought
we
it was
should
something potentially interesting.
Yeah. I actually had a pretty unique path into medical school. It's like I was the worst applicant with respect to getting into med school. So when I applied, the average GPA for people getting into med school was 3.6. Average MCAT was 31, right? I had a 2.9 GPA and a 31 on the MCAT. So acceptable MCAT, terrible GPA. So I went and got a master's degree, right, to shore up my resume. The problem is most medical schools don't care about your master's because they don't know how rigorous your master's was unless they have a similar program at their school. So in any event, I had to scramble just to get into a medical school. I almost didn't make it. In any event, what I learned during my master's program was how to study. So for me, I learned that like spaced repetition learning. So again, just seeing stuff on a regular basis, things that I was more familiar with, seeing less often, but still reminding myself, seeing stuff I was less familiar with more frequently, and asking myself questions about those topics really helped me learn this stuff. But I learned how to study during my master's program. A lot of my colleagues that I went to medical school with had problems learning because they hadn't taken that leap from undergrad to medical school yet. And so they spent a lot of excess time trying to figure out how to study. So if I was making a recommendation for people, like what do you need to do before medical school? My only recommendation to you is to learn how to study for yourself. You don't need to read all these medical textbooks or like, try to take these classes in undergrad so you get a leg up, because it's not a leg up. It's totally different. But you need to learn how to study, develop good study habits. So for me personally, what would I have done differently? I would have actually gone to Norfolk and picked out a living situation that was a little bit better. So I lived in that like retirement home thing, which is the Hague Towers, which was fine because it was real quiet, because retirement. But the problem was whenever they got rain, the whole parking lot just completely flooded. So I'd just gotten this new car, right? I felt like I was on top of the world. And we got this nor'easter, which I don't know what that is because I'm from the Midwest. We have tornadoes and floods. But when they say nor'easter, I'm like, I don't know, Easter egg, whatever. It's like, it's a party. I parked my car in this surprisingly barren parking lot. Nobody was around me. I was like, oh man, I got a sweet parking spot. Nobody's here. It's interesting. There was no standing water in the parking lot, but it was raining. And then I come out 2.5 hours later, the water, no joke, is up to my side view mirror. Yeah, so they end up totaling the car out. So I wish that I would have known, one, like, let's go not live in a retirement home, because I feel like that limited my social, sort of circle first year. And then I also would have like not parked my car there on that particular day.
Regrets.
Yeah. Yes, I has them.
Yeah. My trajectory into medical school was very different, and I did know how to study before I got there, and that set me up for a different experience along the way. I'll take a different spin on this, I guess. Better prepared for during medical school. Something I wish I had learned maybe a bit more effectively over the course of medical school is a lot of the messages that we delivered to you guys this weekend, particularly a lot of the stuff about behavior change and how to talk to people and how to make it happen, and how important of a skill it is to be able to have these difficult conversations. Because, I teach residents and medical students on a daily basis in the hospital. And when I do feedback with them at the end of their rotations, I always tell them, like, anybody can teach you the medicine here. Anybody can teach you how the kidneys work or how the heart pumps and stuff like that. But I think far fewer people are going to teach you how to have these conversations with people, how to have these, elicit the information you need, how to provide the reassurance that people who are in a sick, frail, vulnerable situation need to hear. And so that's something that I had to learn partially. I mean, we got some exposure to that kind of stuff, but I, in retrospect, know that it was not as much as we actually need. And I think that the emphasis is, obviously you have to learn a lot of detail, physiology, biochemistry, a lot of stuff like that. But I think the degree to which being able to have these like social skills is important as being a doctor at the bedside with a patient, I don't think it receives as much emphasis as it deserves in pre-clinical education. And so that's something I wish I would have gotten more of, I think.
Yeah, to their credit, they did do a substantial amount of training.
Yeah,
we were just too stupid.
Yeah, I just think it needs to be even more.
Yeah, we're just too dumb.
Yeah.
Yeah, all right. As long as we agree that we're dumb.
Everybody's stupid.
All right, including us. Question number 3. The notes refer to more than 2 standard drinks of alcohol as a risk factor for high blood pressure. That's true. Could you please clarify what you mean by a standard drink? Yes, there's a wide variety between different countries. You actually printed this out. So effectively in the US, we're talking like 14 grams of pure alcohol, which I know that you guys are carrying your scales when you go out to the bar.
Weighing and measuring grams.
Yeah, but in other countries it's 10 grams. In the US, in general, we talk about this like one beer, 12-ounce beer, or 1 glass of wine. But again, how big is your glass? So that's problematic. It's 5 ounces on average, and then 1.5 ounces of like a hard alcohol. That's a standard drink in the United States.
Assuming it's 80 proof, because you'll have more grams of alcohol in a higher proof spirit. So like, this is about 60 proof, I think.
All right.
No, not 60 proof. It's percent, my bad.
Yeah, so it's 120.
Yeah, so more grams of
Math.
alcohol.
Are you sure math isn't the thing that you wanted to learn during medical school?
Hey. Yes.
All right. Suggestions for isometric core work. I've seen planks mentioned in your content, but triceps seem to be the limiter on those for me. Oh, yeah, I see. So if you're having, so the reason, I guess I'll start over. The reason why I prefer isometric sort of direct ab training, if you're going to do it for strength training purposes, is that that's really their kind of role in the big four that we tend to get asked the most questions about. Also, this is barbell medicine, not like functional fitness medicine. Kettlebell medicine was also taken, so like we have to like form our niche somewhere, so it's barbell medicine. So in general, the role of the abs during those movements tend to be isometric. So I like planks, I like Palloff presses, I like ab wheel rollouts, either from kneeling ab wheel rollouts, or if you can do them from your toes, that's cool. I also like sort of V-sit progressions. L-sit progressions are usually beyond most individuals, but so I think most folks can do planks. If you can't do those, then the Palloff presses tend to be pretty good. And I know somebody at home sitting on a couch saying, planks? Pfft, I don't need a plank. Doesn't do anything. I'll just low bar back squat my way to top tier, high level abdominal strength. Well, guy at home, the recent research on this suggests that a plank and a 6RM back squat have about the same amount of abdominal activation, which means that a plank is like pretty good because it's not the same level of fatigue that you get from a 6RM squat. Right, 6 at RPE 10 would be a substantially fatiguing set for most individuals compared to just doing a 30-second plank. So I'm not saying that you should do planks instead of squats, but in addition to, it'd be fine. On the other hand, if you said, I don't want to do any additional direct ab training because I find it boring and whatever, that's fine too.
Who would say something like that?
Austin does a yearly GPP session. He's just living off previously developed cardiorespiratory fitness from swimming. And at some point, he'll do it, it'll be bi-yearly, and then you'll just keep titrating it up.
Yeah, I mean, you're free to edit this out, but yeah, I don't do ab work, so.
Yeah.
I'm fine with admitting that.
Yeah, that's fine. I think though, if people are asking about it,
sure.
I'm happy with you doing more physical activity, and I want it to be of the correct fatigue stimulus to fatigue ratio.
That's fair.
Is non-HDL cholesterol in the 20 to 40 range still considered okay for someone on statins? Yep.
Next question. No, I'm kidding. So that, assuming that they meant 20 to 40 milligrams per deciliter, I'm wondering if the question is phrased this way because that's a very low level for a non-HDL cholesterol level. And so a lot of times there's concerns about, can these numbers get too low? There's a lot of fear out there about pushing these numbers too low being associated with cognitive issues. That's been studied and hasn't really been shown convincingly. Theoretically, about risk for hemorrhagic stroke, also been studied, not really shown super convincingly. And then a number of other outcomes, such that now the argument or the idea has been that in general, lower is better, and we don't see a threshold where pushing these blood lipid numbers, particularly the blood lipids that tend to be associated with cardiovascular disease, pushing them lower increases risk. So in general, lower is fine. That doesn't necessarily concern me. What I would say though is that, if somebody's levels are that low, my question is, why are they on the medication? Because if they're on the medicine because they've had a bunch of heart attacks before, then I'm like, cool, okay, that makes sense. I want to push them as low as possible because they're super high risk because they've had heart attacks and strokes before. If they've never had a heart attack or a stroke before and they're on one of these medicines for what we call primary prevention, preventing one of these or reducing the risk of these events, I should say, when they've never had one before, maybe they'd already be below that target threshold without the medicine, in which case I'm wondering, do they actually need it? So I'm fine with pushing these numbers that low in somebody who's very high risk. If they're not super, super high risk, then I'm like, if they're below 130 on that non-HDL, then I'm not worried about it, unless they have other reasons to have really high risk, like they're smokers, diabetics, high blood pressure, things like that, that would alter my decision making.
How much did Pfizer pay you to say that? Just shilling for statins now?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, right. Speaking of statins and cholesterol and all that other fun stuff, red meat, chicken, fish are all frequently cited when discussing diet. What about pork or other poultry? Yeah, what about them? This is a kosher establishment, okay? We don't talk about pork. No. So in general, with respect to red meat, so we're talking about like pork, veal, obviously beef. There's actually a pretty expanded topic that includes, or expanded category that all includes those foods and others for red meat. With respect to chicken, fish, other lean protein sources, I'm cool with all of them. There's not really a lean protein source that I'm not like willing to give you a thumbs up on. The caveat that I'll give you is that for red meat, which again includes this sort of veal, beef, pork, offal, is it offal? Offal?
Lamb, sure.
Yeah, whatever. All that stuff, I would recommend limiting that to 3 times per week, just based on the current guidelines for red meat intake. And we discussed that thoroughly in the article, The Science of Red Meat Intake. So effectively, it'd be difficult to eat more red meat than that more often, and also stay under that 10% of total daily calories from saturated fat recommendation that we think is actually important. Okay, and if you want more information on that, read the Science of Red Meat Intake article. We go into the weeds there on that stuff. Anything else?
I don't think so.
What's your favorite protein? Favorite?
I mean,
there's only one answer.
What do you want me to say? Chicken?
No, that's the wrong answer.
It's steak. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah, so mine is bacon, because this is not a kosher establishment. I got you. All right. What is the mechanism for the inflammatory process and autoimmune diseases contributing to muscle protein breakdown? Do you have references?
Always.
Would reducing inflammation first have increased the anabolic impact? Reducing inflammation before what?
Not sure about the last part.
Before
but basically,
the autoimmune disease?
The question has to do with the inflammation, the real inflammation, as I said, that's present in autoimmune conditions. Why does it contribute to muscle protein breakdown, loss of lean body mass, things like that? Yes, the mechanism has to do with what these chemicals that are called inflammatory cytokines. It's a fancy word describing inflammatory signaling molecules that circulate around in the blood. They're at elevated levels in almost all of these inflammatory conditions, both autoimmune disease as well as cancer, as well as a bunch of other things. And at the end stage of this inflammatory process, you can get to this point where somebody might be called cachectic. Cachexia is this condition where you've wasted away a bunch of your lean body mass and you've lost a bunch of your fat mass. And I see that frequently in patients who have been chronically very ill from one of these conditions. They're just skin and bones, no lean body mass and no fat mass, super high risk situation. Those are patients, again, who I mentioned, having that low lean body mass, low functional status. Even if, let's say, it's from cancer, they might not even be deemed eligible for treatment because they're too weak and frail and at risk for having really bad outcomes. They say, the treatment is more likely to kill you sooner than the condition itself. So it's these circulating inflammatory molecules. One example for the biochemistry folks is like a TNF alpha and some of the interleukin molecules. As far as references, I gave a lecture on this topic, molecular signaling with muscle protein synthesis and breakdown in the past. And one of the best papers that I referenced on it was called Molecular Networks in Skeletal Muscle Plasticity. It was written by Hopler and his colleagues. Or you can just Google anything about cachexia and inflammation, CACHEXIA, and inflammation, and that you'll basically go down that rabbit hole of why chronic systemic inflammation can contribute to muscle protein breakdown. You can see how these signaling molecules directly block anabolic signaling, and they contribute to atrophy. So they block building and they promote atrophy, which is bad news, obviously. So, and treating the inflammation can improve anabolic sensitivity. So if you get the inflammation under control, they're more likely to respond to anabolic stimuli, training, exercise, nutrition.
Yeah, that's what I was getting with the last part. So like reducing inflammation, will that improve anabolic impact?
Yeah, treating the condition.
Yes, in these actual inflammatory cases that typically need medical management, yes, that will improve things like muscle mass gain and muscle protein synthesis. On the other hand, lowering your, inflammation when you don't have one of these medical conditions from a little to very little does nothing.
Yeah.
That's a TWD. What strategies do you use in your approach to correcting misinformation or misunderstanding in various settings? Wow. Okay. So what strategy, we'll start with the first one and then, so other than holding barbell medicine seminars and all the information that is already being disseminated through barbell medicine, of course, let me tell you a story. The story is about my life. I previously particularly early on in barbell medicine, I thought it was my job to police the internet to make sure that no BS was being written anywhere that could potentially harm anyone, and I needed to correct everybody. That's a fool's errand, because not only can you never get anywhere close to all of it, you're not actually changing anyone's mind. I still do this from time to time because I'm not very smart. I told you my GPA earlier, so you guys should be well aware of like my ability to like learn things, so not high. So I still do this at times because either I am a glutton for punishment or just, again, not smart, don't learn a lesson. But one thing I've realized is that more productive use of my time, our time, is to actually just create more information. So effectively, like if somebody's saying something silly on the internet, like I can't stop them from saying that, and me directly challenging them is unlikely to work out in my favor. But if I write an article about that particular thing, or make like a long, series, like a tutorial or like a Instagram story, rant thing, that'll reach way more people, help more people, whatever. I particularly like writing stuff or making a YouTube video or whatever, stuff that doesn't disappear and is long-lasting content. That tends to be good because a lot of people are going to see it. Then it's there, I can refer people to it, and then it allows me to really flesh out my ideas. The cool thing is, if I can find some common ground with that person who I originally disagreed with, on occasion, you can sort of strike up a conversation based on that. It's rare, but it has happened before where I end up agreeing with people that have initially been like, oh no, this makes me angry because you're wrong. But it's possible. So my recommendation is for like how to go about this is not correcting people. That writing reflex can occur. I do think in professional settings, it's a little different because usually if you come in guns a-blazing with a bunch of evidence that you're willing to just give people and say, hey, if you have some time, check this out, read it, particularly if they're guidelines or like, bulletins or whatever, those tend to be like, oh shoot, I didn't actually know this. So I think you can do that in professional settings, but in more social settings or like on social media or amongst friends, I probably just wouldn't do that, and I'd focus on creating original content. That would be my take.
Yeah, I agree. The context matters a whole lot here. And so within the public sphere, the social media sphere, things like that, I'll go ahead and say I'm smarter than Jordan, and that I just don't do it. I don't care to engage with people or argue with people or try to go out and correct misinformation. I'm happy to just hear my recommendations. Here's why these are my recommendations, and you people out there are free to take them or not, and that's kind of your decision. And so I actually take a similar approach with patients even, because sometimes clinicians, doctors, healthcare professionals, can get really, really, really overly invested and like paternalistic and like feel excessively responsible for this stuff. And assuming that I have discussed with somebody and feel like I've gotten them adequately educated and I know that I've gotten through to them and my message is clear and been understood, if they choose to pursue a different route with things, then fine, I feel like I've done my job. Whereas sometimes people might take offense to it if somebody doesn't follow their advice, or they might really beat themselves up or get too worked up about it. I see this more often when patients say they want to leave the hospital during the course of my treatment, and I go and I educate them about why I'm recommending maybe they stay, and if I have more work to do or whatever. And if they say, no, I'm leaving, then okay, I can't really beat myself up too much about that. And in social media, I ignore all of that stuff. I definitely don't go down the rabbit hole of arguing with people, or I get tagged every day in things. People like, here, look at this. What are your thoughts? I don't have thoughts. My thoughts have been expressed elsewhere, and you can, again, take my recommendations or not, and that's fine. One day we're all gonna die and things are gonna be just fine. So that doesn't bother me. In the professional setting, among other doctors, among other clinicians, I know, or at least I like to think, that I'm among peers who are going to be more receptive to evidence. And so if you've watched any of my lectures that I've given to other doctors on sarcopenia, or the cancer lecture, or really any of my talks that I've given, my slides are just littered with references and graphs and data and things like that. And that's something that it's obviously important for how we practice, but it's also a strategy to actually convince people that, hey, I actually, know what I'm talking about here, and here's my justification for my belief. Whereas in society, for a lot of this stuff, you don't necessarily need to have a really strong justification for your belief. You can just have beliefs. So if you listen to our last rehab podcast from Reno's Q&A, Michael Ray talked about this YouTube channel that me and him, he introduced me to, called Street Epistemology. And it's a guy who is actually in San Antonio, and he goes around and he'll meet somebody and he'll talk to them a little bit, and he'll elicit, tries to get them to make a claim about something that they believe. And then very gently, kindly, he'll start to delve into this belief and ask them just kind of pointed questions to try to get at the heart of why they believe what they believe. Oftentimes it ends up going down into like religion and things like that. But he's very good at it in terms of getting to why people believe what they believe. But overwhelmingly, what he ends up showing is people can't justify oftentimes what they believe. They just make shit up and they just believe what they believe. And we're very stupid creatures. And so, like Jordan said, it's a fool's errand to go out and try to save the world and correct everything that's wrong out there. So I just don't do it and wouldn't recommend it.
Have you been in an argument in the last week?
Have I been in an argument in the last week? No.
I've been in two.
You've been in two.
Well, to be fair, it's not my fault. One of them was like a scheduled podcast on like injury and technique.
Sure.
Yes. So that I did that to myself.
Yes.
But the second one, this guy was making the claim that because doctors don't receive like advanced nutrition training during medical school, that they should not be counseling patients on dietary changes. To which my reply is, why do you need to know all these intricacies to do that behavioral change counseling? You don't. Just like you don't need to be a programming whiz or like a high level coach in order to help people in achieve these physical activity guideline minimums. You don't need that. You need to be experienced to know what to do for troubleshooting, for like performance, right? Or have a big toolbox for cueing people in real time, sure. But to the extent that you need this huge fund of knowledge just to like be able to draw up some initial recommendations, like I don't think you need that.
Yeah.
Or I would prefer that in fact your toolkit was more robustly stocked with behavioral counseling techniques.
Yeah, I mean, most of you guys who are here this weekend, you probably are now feeling a little bit more comfortable at what the basic outlines of what we would recommend as a healthy dietary pattern might look like, right? So energy intake and protein, fiber, how the fat distribution looks like, and then within that, there's tons of latitude. So cool. You don't need to have hyper advanced training to be able to counsel somebody on some of that stuff. Yeah. But having those conversations is the hard part.
Under what clinical cases are you using the advanced lipid testing? Does it change counseling efficacy outcomes in the setting of mild to moderate, elevated, non-HDL to change lifestyle behaviors? Let's back up. What is advanced lipid testing?
So the basic lipid panel, as I discussed in the lecture, involves measuring total cholesterol, triglycerides, HDL cholesterol, and then off of that is oftentimes calculated an LDL cholesterol level. And then the best metric, again, off of that is to take the total, subtract the HDL, and get a non-HDL cholesterol level. That's the best metric off of the standard lipid panel, non-advanced.
What are some examples of advanced lipid testing?
So advanced lipid testing would involve things like measuring what we call an ApoB level. An apolipoprotein B level would be one example. Others would be direct particle measurements, so measuring not the cholesterol on the particles, but the particles themselves, so LDL particle concentration, for example, the lipo profile, the NMR, things like that are advanced lipid testing. Probably the main situation where I'd order one of these advanced tests is if I have somebody who I have been treating them, I have their blood lipids where I want them to be, and yet they're still having cardiovascular problems. For example, somebody's blood lipids look great, and they're coming in and they're still having, they just had a new heart attack. Well, we got a problem, right? Because I have you where I think I would like you to be, but you just had another event, a heart attack or a stroke or something like that. So there are sometimes situations where the standard lipid test might not tell us all the information we need. So somebody who's having these sorts of events, heart attacks or strokes with blood lipids that otherwise look good, then I'd probably measure an ApoB level, I'd measure a lipoprotein A level, and I'd start treating things more aggressively from there to get their risk down further. Otherwise, I don't really measure them.
And does having all this information like change how patients respond to your counseling techniques?
No.
Okay. Yep.
Wouldn't check it otherwise. Yes. Yeah, more information is not always better.
Any tips or techniques you find generally helpful for increasing motivation or discipline in training? Oof. I mean,
this is a tough one.
It is a tough one, but I think I go back to some of the stuff we talked about during the behavioral change lecture, and then additionally we kind of kept sprinkling in, like, I think you should enjoy this. So I think you should enjoy not only the training you're doing, but and the components of that, but the actual process. So like your goal-oriented training. So I think if somebody's like really having a hard time like sticking to it, I'd wonder like, do you like what you're doing? Is this enjoyable for you? And if it is, great. So what's holding you back? Because there are some things that, you know, come up that people generally respond to in a way where they might need some additional counseling. So like, for instance, if somebody misses day one of the workout, I've seen it a lot of times where people will just not work out the rest of the week. They're like, I missed my first day, this week's off, I'm just gonna repeat this week next week. It's like an all or none phenomenon. And it's like, no, don't do that. Or like, no, but if I don't work out today, then tomorrow's my scheduled rest day, then I'll have to work out tomorrow, and then have 2 workouts back to back, and that's like bad because I need to perform optimally on all these days. And it's like, no, just put all the workouts together. We have literally a litany of different questions on our forum that's like, hey, I'm leaving town for the week. On Friday, and I have 4 workouts to do this week. What do? And it's like workout Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Go on your vacation. And I don't say that like to be dismissive, right? But it's like the actual acute performance during your workout doesn't really matter as much as you getting the total training. So that's just one common thing that I see all the time, that people are struggling for time, resources in order to train. And I think working around that can help people stay adherent to the training program, provided they like what they're doing. But if someone hates what they're doing, right, or is fearful of what they're doing, that's problematic. The third thing that I find really important is the social aspect here. So if people are doing this by themselves, so like they have a home gym and they're the only one in their house that uses the home gym, or if none of their family members work out, even immediate or extended, none of their friends work out, they're just effectively leaving their social circle. They're saying, I've got to leave my family, I got to leave all my friends, and I go to the gym where I don't know many people. That's a hard sell for a lot of people. And so I think to the degree you can leverage social support, you can make things more it's like economical from a time perspective, and then make it enjoyable. Those are my big sort of things that you can practically apply to the programming and the social support network to get people to adhere to training. But as far as actually finding motivation in people, that's tough. You know, you got to give them the old Gipper talk, like, why, you know, what do you want to do with this? What do you want to get out of this? Where do you want to be in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months? You know, how do your actions on a daily basis lead you closer to or further away from that particular goal? Something.
Yeah. I think I don't love I don't love centering this discussion around the idea of discipline at all. We've talked in some of our previous Q&As and on podcasts and stuff like that, you know, in the past decade, we can count how many workouts we've missed on one hand or less. Even last week when I was laid up with the flu, I still went out and did my deadlift day on Tuesday. And like I said, I almost passed out trying to pull 405. And people might say, you're an idiot, you're crazy for trying to go do that. And I was like, well, I think back to that day, right? I'm having like coughing and chills and sweats on the couch, and I feel like shit. Why did I go out to the gym and try to do that? Was it because I'm just like a total badass and more disciplined than anyone else on earth? No, it's because I actually enjoy training. And I got up that day and I was like, well, today would normally be a training day, and I like training. So it would make me feel better, maybe, if I went out and tried to do something. Now, I probably tried to pull more than I was ready for on that day, right? But I did it because I actually enjoy training. If I loathed training, if I hated training, and I felt that sick, that's like double barrier to try to go out and do that thing, right? So I look back to why have we not missed a training session in the past decade, basically, or a couple, right? Because we actually enjoy training. And to the extent that maybe we've both definitely like skipped out on certain, like, say, social engagements or something because training was more important to us, it's because we enjoy doing that, right? So the enjoyment piece, I think, is underemphasized, underrated. It's not that, you know, we're just like better than you because we can do this thing that we hate, right? Even when we don't want to. Hey, we actually enjoy doing this thing. Yeah. So I think finding that, like, why you're doing this and trying to play that up is a bigger piece there than just saying you're not disciplined enough to do this, right? You're a bad person because you didn't do this session because you're not disciplined enough. I don't think that that's a good way to view human behavior, really, in general.
Also, Rick Ross helps.
Always. Instant PRs.
Instant PRs.
Yeah.
Yes. All right. Let's see. If butter is to be limited in a healthy diet, Where do you rank other dairy products with high fat content? Cream, certain cheeses, certain brands of whole milk with 4 to 5% milk fat. Yeah, so Austin, I know you mentioned this.
We get a lot of questions about this. We got one recently in our group.
Yeah, so
dairy.
So just to go back to the kind of beginning of this, the overall recommendation with respect to saturated fat intake is to keep it less than 10% of total daily calories. In particular, the main focus there is going to be saturated fat from red meat. It appears that dairy, like saturated fat from dairy, does not appear to have the same deleterious effect that red meat does. In fact, there may actually be some like beneficial effects from dairy consumption. That being said, the recommendation still is less than 10% of your total daily calories from saturated fat. To the degree you can fit butter in there, cream, milk with 5% fat, which probably tastes great. It's probably, but you have to probably drink it with a spoon. Like you can't even like, you have to like,
yeah.
It's fine. But I think, again, if we start with the 10% saturated fat from total daily calories, that's like the initial start. And then most of that, the biggest concern there is red meat intake.
Yeah, I think that, when I talk about dairy with people, it tends to be limited to non-butter dairy sources. There's actually some evidence that there are some there's this concept that we didn't even touch on because, again, everything is way more complicated, and even what we delivered to you guys this weekend was like markedly simplified. There's this concept called the food matrix, and it has to do with kind of like the chemical structure of the food and the proteins and other molecules that are involved in it, and those can all alter the physiological effects of a given food. And so in the course of processing a dairy type food into butter, for example, it actually removes some factors that end up ultimately being quite protective. And so when I'm talking about dairy, I tend to limit it to non-butter dairy sources. And so saturated fats from non-butter dairy sources, I tend to actually not sweat that much. But the processing that ends up producing butter out of it tends to remove a lot of these protective factors that result in butter being being more deleterious and more harmful from a blood lipid cardiovascular risk standpoint. So I tend to not sweat the non-butter dairy sources or saturated fat from those sources very much.
Do you put butter in your coffee?
Never would I ever do that.
Do you put coconut oil in your coffee?
That sounds awful.
Do you brush your teeth with coconut oil? Jordan said, oh boy. Anytime I see that in a question, I'm just like...
I probably didn't say that.
Yeah, I probably didn't say that, but here we are. Jordan said during the seminar that enjoyment in exercise has the biggest impact on adherence. Oh, that's true. I did say that. Coming back to lifting after a long layoff. I found it difficult to find enjoyment with weights that are so far below what I used to be able to do. Any suggestions or resources on how to start enjoying training again? I don't have any resources on this. It'd be great if we had a book that was like, enjoying training, like just like a whole book on like how to make
starting enjoyment.
Yeah, starting pleasure, right? Just yes, lifting weights is very pleasurable. Yeah, that's gross. So
starting hedonism.
Starting hedonism, yeah, a way to use light weights to All right, I actually do have a strategy for this because this happened to me. I did CrossFit for like 8 months. Yeah, I experimented with the dark arts, and I lost a substantial amount of weight and a substantial amount of strength. Now, I'm not sure those two things were related because I wasn't really lifting weights during that time. I was doing a bunch of Olympic lifts, and I wasn't squatting, benching, or deadlifting, and yeah, my weight went down as well. So when I came back, I remember I squatted. I used Leah's belt. This is how yes. This is how like cachectic I was. I was 100. I remember Tom and I came back from Australia, and I was 85 kilos, which is like all of 185 pounds or something like that. And I used Leah's belt, and I squatted 180 kilos, which is 396 for a hard triple. To be clear, I've benched that before for a triple. So like things were bad.
That's bad.
And I was like, what? So I'd recently decided to like quit doing CrossFit because I didn't like it. And then, so enjoyment was low. And I was like, I'll just go back to powerlifting because I love that. And then I did powerlifting for one day, and I was like, no, where's all my strength? So the strategy that I used on the exercises that I had a lot of history with, so squat, bench, deadlift, I changed the rep range to things I didn't have experience with. So for example, I had never really done squats or bench or deadlift for sets of 8 and 10. I stuck to mostly those, and I picked different exercise variations that I had very little experience with previously, so that I didn't have this like historical like performance barometer that I kept going up against. And so I did that. And honestly, I remember it was like 6 to 8 weeks after I came back, I was within about 10% of my normal strength levels. And so I was happy again and could train like relatively regularly. The benefits of this are kind of twofold. One, you don't hate yourself every time you go to the gym and think, woe is me, this is the worst I've ever performed in my whole life. And then benefit number 2 is that you're sort of gradually retraining yourself to do a different thing. So remember, I'd been doing CrossFit for 8 months. I was not squatting, benching, and deadlifting like I was during my normal powerlifting training. Had I just switched back to powerlifting with no sort of bridge in between, that could have potentially been problematic for me. However, I had this sort of on-ramp where I was able to sort of get back to that normal training, and so that worked out pretty well for me. So generally, that's how I recommend folks do that. If they have a specific goal that's different than their normal that we've been training for a while, and then they want to go back to a previous type of training, I program this like GPP-related bridge where the rep ranges are different, the exercise selection is different, so they don't have this like, again, historical thing that they're comparing themselves against each single time. You can do that a lot of different ways. You can do that with rep ranges, you can do it with adding chains or bands or different barbells or different sort of range of motion or tempo. There's a lot of different things you can use.
I just actually dealt with this very scenario, although not entirely due to a liftoff. I had a patient of mine who I have been working with for a little while who was recently diagnosed with cancer. And specifically, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. And one of the standard treatments for prostate cancer is what's called androgen deprivation therapy, where you basically get put on testosterone blockers. You can think of it like that. You get like chemically castrated, basically to prevent androgen stimulating the prostate cancer from growing anymore. So we're intentionally making him hypogonadal. And he was observing that his performance was going down in the gym. When you're truly hypogonadal, then sure, we would expect that your performance is going to be altered with that. And he was having some distress over this because he pulled 500 at nationals last year, and now he's like, I'm seeing my numbers start to change. And so what should I do? I'm not really loving training now that I'm weaker. And I just said, we need to change the metrics of performance here. We need to pick some different exercises, right? Rather than a competition squat and a competition deadlift and a pause bench press, we need to pick some other things that you haven't done before, give you some new opportunities to PR. Right? So now that if you're going to be doing pause squats and deficit deadlifts and stuff like that, every time you train is going to be a PR. And so we changed the strategy, and he's now fully on board with that idea and training with some different things. So again, same deal, so that he doesn't have this constant prior performance to compare himself to. So that's what we did with him. So effectively the same thing, just do different things, and you'll have less of a metric of comparison.
Yeah, just change the goalposts.
Yeah.
Boom. All right, 2 co-workers were discussing their supposed back problems together. Both were told by their doctors that they have permanent life-altering conditions with their backs. These sedentary office workers are convinced that they are disabled, handicapped parking spots and all. However, they're visibly fine as they get around the office with no issues. Without them asking for my help, how can I address this without scaring or insulting them, if at all possible? In general, they are stubborn just like the rest of us. I don't think there's anything you can do, to be frank. Well, I'm Jordan, but to be frank, I don't think there's anything you can do. And the doctor was right. They have permanent life-altering conditions in their backs, just like all of us do.
Having a back.
Yeah, and things change over time. I'm not sure the medical legal process that you have to go through to get a handicap parking spot.
You need to get a doctor to sign your form.
Right, correct. So that's probably there. And maybe this is all just a ploy for the handicap sign. I don't know. Maybe they go swing dancing every Friday night. You don't know. But the point is, you're asking, how can you get somebody to change their behavior, all right, without being able to engage them, and then go through the rest of those steps. So focusing, evoking, and then planning together. You guys don't have that relationship. You haven't established it. So you can't. The simple answer is you can't. And I don't mean that to say you shouldn't even try and it's not worth trying. Everything's meaningless. We're all going to eventually re-enter the carbon cycle, although that's true. I think that because you can't establish any sort of relationship with the person, that you're probably best suited by directing your efforts towards other things.
Yeah, I would say 2 things here. I would say, number 1, I would caution you against making assumptions about what's actually going on with this person. it may seem like they're getting, it says they're visibly fine as they get around the office, but just making assumptions is generally problematic. So you don't actually know what's going on with them, what their history is, what they actually have going on. But number two, we know that actually one of the big predictors of long-term disability from back pain is actually the potential for some sort of positive gain, like monetary compensation, for example. I've dealt with this before when working in the military system or in the VA system, for example, where getting your level of disability upgraded can result in higher levels of monetary compensation or other sorts of secondary benefits. And that is not my favorite way of a system being set up because it incentivizes disability, basically, right? There are benefits to being disabled so that rather than there being benefits or incentivizing people to improve and return to their normal function. So you're up against a really tough situation here, and kind of like we were talking about earlier as far as addressing disinformation, I think you're best spending that time and effort not doing that, not really addressing that, and letting that person live their life. And if they approach you and say, man, I see what you're doing in the gym and living your life and I'm interested in that, then there you go. Your foot has been firmly put in the door and you can start to have that conversation. But otherwise, I probably wouldn't go out of my way. Sometimes we all have to accept that we can't save the world. And that's just kind of the way it is. So
what's that phrase? It's it's not the live, laugh, love, but it's please grant me the serenity to accept the things I don't know. It's it's right after live, laugh, love. It's the second.
Yeah, basically, focusing on the things that you can control and letting go of the things you can't. It's one of these Stoic philosophy things.
Yeah, sure.
Yes.
Sure, I'm gonna get that tattooed on my ankle.
All right. Sick. Last question.
Based on the nutrition lecture, it seems that there isn't any significance placed on timing of macro consumption over the course of a day. Is that for simplicity or because there's really no evidence to support its importance?
I put this in there specifically to trigger you.
Who are you?
About chrononutrition.
Yeah, so if you keep your ear to the ground and you're on the interwebs, then you're likely aware of this emerging science about chrononutrition, effectively what time during the day you end up consuming the bulk of your nutrition. It's an emerging area of research, and there's some evidence suggesting that individuals who consume the bulk of their calories earlier in the day may have better outcomes with respect to weight loss and body composition, stuff like that, than if you consume the bulk of your calories later on in the day. A couple problems with this. The control of these studies is pretty rough, meaning that they're not keeping these people under lock and key and saying you guys are all going to eat the same amount of calories. It's basically free living individuals. So it's likely the individuals who did not lose as much weight or who had worse body composition likely consumed more calories. That's the most likely explanation, but I'm not ready to write this off and say there's nothing there. I think a lot of this has to do with adherence, and I know that there's additional data corroborating this idea of eating during a certain time of the day based on how consistent you are with eating the similar meals at a given time during the day. I also know that working out, what time you work out, might have an impact on your chrononutrition. So for example, if you work out in the evening, then it doesn't really matter as much that you consumed the bulk of your nutrition earlier on in the day versus later on in the day. So where do I stand on this right now? I think that we would like to develop a dietary plan that you can adhere to long-term, that you can consistently hit day in and day out, right? And that ultimately supports whatever you need to do with respect to your weight, whether it be lose weight, maintain weight, gain weight, and supports your physical activity levels. Should you bias the bulk of your nutrition to earlier in the day? If you work out earlier in the day, I'd be more comfortable saying that. And I don't think that I could say that you should bias your nutrition, any particular place outside of something that improves adherence with the actual diet. I don't know if you have anything addition that you want to.
Not much else. I just know that the chrononutrition topic gets you going.
It doesn't trigger me. It's just, I think that, people in general with respect to medical research, there are people who read either biomedical research or nutrition research, and as soon as they see it, they're like, yep, that's a new thing. I want it. That is my jam. I'm gonna, make an Instagram infographic about it, and then I'm gonna be the guru on this. Even if there's not enough information to know about this stuff right now. That's like the people who say they're gut biome experts, right? And they don't have a PhD, MD after their name, right? You are not a gut microbiome expert. You're, a YouTuber or something, right? And you're selling poop teas and waist trainers. It's problematic, okay? With respect to chrononutrition, I know of 2 experts on this right now. One is Alan Flanagan. You can read more about this at his website, which is called alinea.com. Or he's also on Sigma Nutrition. So if you're interested in this stuff, you can check out both of those places. But I don't necessarily have a firm opinion on how we should structure our meals through the day outside of improving adherence.
I agree overall. And I think that to your last point, there's an excellent article that I'd recommend that anybody who's a clinician probably read, and to the extent that it's accessible to non-clinicians, if you're a coach, it's an article by some bright folks called "The Case for Being a Medical Conservative." And basically, it's along the lines of what Jordan was just saying, where there's tons of like latest, greatest, like new hotness that comes out in the biomedical literature. Yeah. And in general, it's a fool's errand to immediately take up this stuff and be like, 100% on the train for things, because most things don't work. When it comes down to it, most things that we do don't work. So there's a case for being a medical conservative insofar as you are kind of a late adopter of things once a sufficient body of evidence is accumulated to support a particular idea, belief, or kind of treatment approach. And so I think that's probably where we are right now in terms of where our emphasis is with respect to nutrition. We are probably not at the point where we're micromanaging when people eat compared to what they're eating. But if more evidence comes out, I know that Flanagan, who I coach, and I get very amusing check-ins from about how he's like plant-powered and things like that in his powerlifting training. He's doing some of his PhD research on this stuff. They're actually locking some people in a lab and doing some like jet lag effects on how that influences their metabolic processes and things like that. Maybe we will be convinced by more of this stuff to emphasize it more. But as of now, I think the nutrition guidelines that we laid out with respect to energy intake, protein, fiber, fat proportions, things like that, and then outside of that, the beauty of that having that such limited recommendations is that there's tons of room for individualization, preference, variability outside of that. So if people like to fast or they don't, people like certain foods or other foods within those guidelines, there's tons of room and they have tons of options to you. And that's a good thing. The more recommendations and restrictions and limitations, it's just going to become harder to adhere to. So let's, stick with what we have really good evidence for. And then I'm fine with once somebody is meeting those things, if we want to manipulate the timing, then cool. But that's not my first priority with people.
People always want more rules. They're no, you have to do all of this stuff in order to be adherent.
Yeah.
The whole life.
And you have to be super disciplined to do it, right? Because that makes you a good person.
Well, right. You're like a samurai.
Right. Okay. Hey, we did it.
All right, San Diego, thank you guys so much for coming out. It's the end of our Q&A. Thank you so much for coming. Woo! See you guys later on. You could have seen us on my sleep shoulder. Everything in the rose gold, it might go for me. Couldn't pinpoint in the globe, so I wanted to go from it. Just know that I don't fit in, but I wanna feel everything. Everything, yeah. Everything, yeah. Yeah, everything, yeah. Everything, yeah. Yeah, everything, yeah. But I wanna feel it.